Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me this morning. A cold, freezing morning it is as well. As I've just been introduced, Tracy Bowyer, I'm the parent and coordinator for the ADHD Foundation, and we're going to do a whistle-stop tour of ADHD and how it may well present for girls. Now, we haven't really got enough time really to talk about ADHD and go into detail in terms of the diagnostic criteria. So if you are a parent of a female and you're kind of at the start of that journey, then I would suggest if you go to, I know on the Witherslack YouTube channel that they have got an what is ADHD webinar. So I would strongly suggest that you go and watch that if you want some more information about ADHD in general, really. And that was delivered by a former colleague of mine, Aaron Hutchinson. So check that out if you're at the start of your journey and you do need some additional information. So what I am going to talk about today now, just to be mindful that it doesn't only apply to girls. Certainly some of what we talk about today can be applied to some boys, and there's no one specific way that ADHD will present for any individual, really. But what I want to talk about is, I suppose, some of the common challenges, common issues faced by our females. In terms of ADHD, I will just give a very brief overview of the diagnostic criteria. Like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but in terms of ADHD, so the title, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, not the best name, doesn't really reflect, I don't feel, what the condition is, what ADHD is. So for me, I've got a neurodivergent family. Some of my family members are ADHD, and I don't necessarily feel that the terms deficit and disorder are something that reflect my children, my family members. So not great. I tend to prefer to talk about ADHD in terms of difference rather than disorder. But regarding the diagnostic manuals, the diagnostic criteria that is used by clinicians, unfortunately, that is the title that we're lumped with at the moment. But when we're thinking about ADHD, what that diagnostic criteria talks about is to be diagnosed, there needs to be a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity. Now, again, thinking about that in inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity. So that in itself can often challenge what a lot of people believe about ADHD. So there's a lot of misconception about ADHD that you need to have the hyperactive element to receive a diagnosis of ADHD, but you actually don't need to. So the DSM-5, which is one of the diagnostic manuals that our clinicians will use when they are assessing for ADHD, it states inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity. And this is often one of the reasons that our females, our girls, our daughters are often sort of go unnoticed, go misdiagnosed. There are three subtypes of ADHD. So we have ADHD as that sort of overarching diagnosis. And within that, we've got the three subtypes of ADHD. So one of those subtypes is the inattentive type ADHD. So as you can imagine, that's challenges with the attentional system, challenges with maybe being able to focus, concentrate, staying on task. And our girls, our females, women, they are frequently diagnosed with this subtype. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail as I go through the session. But the key thing about that is in terms of the characteristics of inattention, they are typically not as obvious as those characteristics of hyperactivity, impulsivity. So they tend to be sort of more discrete, more internalized, as opposed to those more obvious characteristics of hyperactivity, impulsivity. The second subtype of ADHD is a hyperactive impulsive type. So that is challenges primarily with things like impulse control. We may see challenges with physical and or mental hyperactivity. And then finally, the third subtype of ADHD, which is combined type ADHD. So that is challenges in all of those areas. So we're going to see challenges with that attentional system. We're going to see challenges with impulsivity and that physical or mental hyperactivity. hyperactivity. Now, like I said, for our females, for our girls, our daughters, quite often they are diagnosed with that inattentive type ADHD, but also, they may well be diagnosed with that hyperactivity impulsivity element. But what we find is sometimes it can maybe take a little bit longer to be recognized, identified, because of how that may well present for our females. So that's what we're going to talk about as we go through the session. Excuse me, apologies, I have got a bit of a cough today. So thinking about what is ADHD. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition. So that's basically differences in how the brain develops, how it processes information, how it learns, and affects approximately 5% of the UK population. So that's 1 in 20 people. Now, ADHD is characterized by, like I've said, inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity. And we'll have a little think about what that looks like as we go through the session. The exact cause of ADHD is not fully understood at the moment, but it is thought to be largely genetic, with approximately 70–80% of individuals having that genetic element. But there is also potentially additional factors that may well exacerbate or increase the likelihood of ADHD. So thinking about things like difficult pregnancy, premature birth, trauma and brain injury as well. In terms of the diagnostic criteria to receive a diagnosis of ADHD, it needs to be present before the age of 12. Now, this doesn't mean that our children and young people have to be diagnosed before the age of 12. And certainly for our girls, our females, what we find is quite often they are more likely to receive a diagnosis in the late teens or in adulthood. But what it does mean is when we look at ADHD and with our ADHD lens on, suppose, if we look at the developmental history of our children, if we look at, their presentation through childhood before the age of 12, then what we see is that actually with that ADHD lens, those characteristics were present throughout. For our daughters, it might be that, we didn't identify that it was ADHD. We didn't recognize those characteristics as being ADHD. But certainly once we've got that lens on, we sort of do see that they were present all along, and certainly before the age of 12. I've worked with lots of families who, mothers of ADHD children, when they've gone on their journey with their child, that what happens is, as they're starting to learn about how ADHD may look, how it may well present, then what they find is actually they identify with those characteristics. Those characteristics were present for them through their childhood, through their lifespan as well. Also, it needs to be present in 2 or more settings. Again, for our girls, this can sometimes present as a bit of a challenge. So typically, we will what will be looked at is whether those characteristics are present in the home setting, and also quite often in the education setting. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges with that in terms of, firstly, that presentation of ADHD may be looking differently for our girls, but also in terms of masking. So certainly lots of families that I support, it can sometimes cause some anxiety around how our girls present differently in the educational setting to at home. And there was a myth, there's still some people still do believe that actually in terms of ADHD that they can't mask, and that's not the case. We know that for ADHD individuals that they are more than capable, more than able, and often do mask in different settings. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go through the session as well. It is a lifespan condition, so our children, our young people, they're born with ADHD, they're going to go through childhood, through adolescence, and mature into adulthood with ADHD. Now, how that looks, again, well, it may vary. No child stays the same. How we present as children, typically looks different to how we present as an adult. But so the characteristics may change, may vary, may look different, but it's certainly something that is going to be part and parcel of everyday life throughout our lifespan. And then also just to touch on co-occurrence. So co-occurrence is basically having one or more condition And for more than 2/3 of our children and young people who have ADHD, they're going to have at least one coexisting condition. Now, it might be another neurodivergent condition. So, for example, it may be autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia, for example. They're quite common conditions that we see alongside ADHD. It may well be things like sleep disorders or anxiety, depression. Quite often, what we find for our girls is they've often been diagnosed with other conditions before it's been identified that it is actually ADHD. And that can be because of sometimes similar characteristics across certain conditions. It might be because the characteristics of ADHD have not been recognised. In terms of the difference between boys and girls, so thinking about the diagnostic ratios first of all, so boys are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed than our girls currently. And so again, that is often due to ADHD for our girls just presenting differently, or those traits, those characteristics not being recognised. We see higher levels of missed diagnosis and misdiagnosis. So girls who are, like I've said, not recognised as being ADHD may be identified as having anxiety, depression, or other conditions before any consideration being put towards it being ADHD. And so them getting that diagnosis quite often for our daughters, our girls as well. It can be that because of masking, because of sort of hiding those characteristics that, again, they're just not picked up on. And so we find that for our teenagers, they tend to be diagnosed much later. So in those teenage years, or as an adult, like I mentioned earlier. And one of the reasons for that as well is the fact that the studies, the research, the diagnostic criteria is all being focused on that male presentation. So that stereotypical sort of presentation and the stereotypical view really of ADHD being that a boy's condition really. And like I've said, for our females, for our girls, they can also mask. So, masking is basically hiding or camouflaging those ADHD characteristics, maybe to blend in socially, to avoid being stigmatized, to feel more accepted, for example. And so we can often see that now in terms of masking, both boys and girls can mask, but what the research tells us is for females, for girls, they are more likely to mask more frequently and for longer periods of time. And then finally, just thinking about that presentation of ADHD. So for our girls, the presentation are the characteristics of usually more internalized, that like I mentioned, and not really, maybe less noticeable, I suppose. Quite often for our girls, the characteristics are put down to maybe personality traits rather than being seen as a sign of ADHD. They are more likely to internalize any challenges that they may have. So, for example, if they're feeling overwhelmed, then because of masking, they may sort of hide that, they internalize that and present as calm and composed despite feeling overwhelmed. I also think in terms of the expectations to conform to, I suppose, societal expectations, social norms, girls are expected to be sort of polite, well-behaved, compliant, nurturing, more socially adept than boys. And so our girls are often sort of socialized in that way. And again, so that can sort of mask that presentation of of ADHD for our girls. Some examples of how it may look differently. Now, like I said from the very beginning, these are not exclusive to girls and boys. We can have, girls and boys interchangeably presenting with all of these characteristics, but just to give us a bit of an idea, really, in terms of how it might look differently. So we might have our girls thinking about inattention, maybe sort of lost in thought, daydreaming, for example. as opposed to maybe a boy that we can see is visibly distracted by maybe any external stimulation that's going on. So maybe distracted by whatever's going on outside of the window. We can see for our girls that maybe they struggle with, if we give them multi-step instructions or being able to finish or complete a task. So it might be that they really struggle with that, as opposed to a boy who, once they are struggling with those instructions, then they just sort of disengage, I suppose, and start doing something else. Seeming disorganized, so for our girls, maybe losing items, maybe sort of quite messy spaces, messy school bags, messy schoolwork, for example, as opposed to maybe boys forgetting assignments or just not doing the assignments, or sort of not following the instructions as they should. Our females, they may find that they hyper focus on tasks that they enjoy. They might, so that when they're able to hyper focus, so hyper focus just means being able to give their full attention, and sometimes for quite long periods of time, on tasks that they enjoy. And so that in of itself can then sort of hide or mask the fact that maybe they struggle with that inattention. So, it might be that it's not picked up that they struggle with maintaining that attention, because when it's something that they enjoy, they're very stimulating interest and focus, they're able to focus for longer periods of time. So that can hide that inattention. Sometimes our boys are maybe more disruptive when they are experiencing that inattention, and whereas our girls are sort of just seen as forgetful. Maybe they just quietly disengage in the class. They sort of don't disrupt what is going on in the classroom. Impulsivity, so just some examples of how that might differ between boys and girls. So we might see girls who just kind of generally, I suppose, interrupt conversations, speaking out, maybe giving answers out in class, as opposed to boys who maybe blaze out answers in class, but also dominate group discussions. Difficulty with waiting their turns, but not necessarily blatantly so. They might really struggle with that, as opposed to a boy who is, maybe struggles with waiting turns and might sort of grab items or push others. Or girls maybe become sort of more restless, I suppose, when they're and impatient, waiting for the turn, as to that physical actions of our boys. Making impulsive decisions in friendships or oversharing personal information. I always think about, girls that I've supported, and when they've overshared information on social media, for example, sort of not thinking things through, as opposed to boys who are just maybe interrupt or dominate those conversations. We can also see, thinking about emotional impulsivity. So we might see, emotional outbursts looking like maybe crying or maybe withdrawal, as opposed to big emotional outbursts as well. Oh, sorry. And then just thinking about the differences in terms of hyperactivity, some examples. So our girls, quite often, they may well be quite chatterboxes, talk excessively. Maybe they appear sort of socially over energetic, is I suppose a way to put it, really. More likely to, our boys are more likely to be sort of exhibit that physical overt hyperactivity. So for example, lots of running, lots of climbing, not being able to keep still. So we may see that. Excuse me. Our girls may well be, in terms of hyperactivity, it may look like that sort of restlessness. So just can't keep still, but sometimes in, I suppose, more discreet ways. So we might see them sort of picking their fingernails, picking their skin, playing with their hair, tapping their feet, tapping their fingers, as opposed to maybe those fidgety, squirmy little boys who can't stay in their seat, I suppose. So that internal hyperactivity might manifest as that constant feeling of restlessness, can't quite settle, having those busy brains, lots and lots of tabs open. Again, as opposed to boys who may be physically hyperactive, interrupting, dominating, and disrupting classes or activities. And then thinking as well about, if our females become maybe, if they're expected to sit for long periods of time, becoming physically agitated, and maybe an increase in those more discrete fidgets, I suppose. And then thinking about our boys with physical energy, disrupting those activities, classroom settings, social environments as well. I think for our girls as well, we can see them being maybe hyper emotional sometimes as well. But we tend to see for the more sort of discrete hyperactivity, so that reduced physical hyperactivity, really, all of which are less noticeable. So that can be why we find it can be difficult thinking about that combined type of ADHD, that hyperactive impulsivity element of ADHD. For our girls, because it's more discrete, because it's less noticeable, then it can mean that it's less likely to be picked up or to be noticed. Also, for our girls, like I've said, it's often referred to as a personality trait rather than being recognised as ADHD. So if we just have a little think about what that might look like, I'll just get these all up on the screen for you. So if we think about what the sign of ADHD, a characteristic of ADHD might be our girls who are quite easily distracted, and yet it might be that they're labelled, oh yeah, she's just a daydreamer, dolly daydreamer, she's always in a world of her own. Maybe if they are quite withdrawn, they're, oh yeah, she's just shy. If they struggle with remembering information, quite forgetful, oh, she's just ditzy, she's just a scatterbrain. If we have females or girls who are quite hyper talkative, oh, she's just a chatterbox. She's always chatting away to herself. Emotional responses. So if we see, young people, girls who are quite emotional, emotional impulsivity, for example, oh, she's just a drama queen. And then what's not on there and should be on there really is if we do see those physical characteristics of ADHD, that physical hyperactivity, so those big movements, and that then they're often labeled as tomboys rather than it being identified again as that ADHD characteristic. So often put down to personality traits rather than being recognized as ADHD. Thinking about masking in more detail. So ADHD masking, like I've said, is when someone with ADHD, they present in a way that hides or makes them seem as if they don't have ADHD. It might be because they don't want to stand out. So they're trying to maybe hide their traits or camouflage their traits. Now, this can be conscious or subconscious. And it might include things like perfectionism. It might include maybe trying to suppress strong emotions, withdrawing from social situations and interactions, mirroring or mimicking other people's social behaviors. So maybe their friends or their peers, sort of copying their social behaviors, attempting to hide if they do experience that physical hyperactivity, their physical energy, trying to hide that excess energy, might become people pleasers. They might overcompensate. So when I say overcompensate, things like, for example, staying too quiet and being really careful about what they say because they're conscious that they maybe talk quite a lot. They're being told that they are, they talk too much or they interrupt people, for example. It might be, for example, maybe being obsessively checking that they've got all the belongings they need because they know that they struggle with organization, or they're always struggling to lose things, hiding that they feel overwhelmed, suppressing maybe some characteristics that help them to regulate, for example, as well. might sort of try and may appear shy, maybe appear quiet, or overly agreeable to avoid drawing attention themselves. And ADHD masking can be a way for our girls to try and fit in socially, avoid being stigmatized, like I've said, to feel more accepted. But for me, that then what can happen is, and certainly if you read or listen to women talking about their experience of ADHD, what they mask, and what they often say, that it leads to emotional burnout, it leads to anxiety, it can lead to depression over time. And like I said, our boys can mask equally, as can girls. But what we find is for our girls, for our daughters, they're likely to mask more frequently and for longer periods of time. Thinking about executive function skills. So, executive function skills is basically refers to a set of mental skills, really, that support us with planning, organising, managing time, regulating emotions. And girls with ADHD, they often experience challenges in this area. So, all individuals with ADHD, they usually have challenges with executive functions. But again, for our girls, these challenges with executive functions can often be overlooked, again, because their tendency to mask their difficulties, I suppose, or them appearing to be outwardly compliant. So we might see for some of our children difficulty organising tasks. So they may struggle to keep those schoolwork, their books, their personal items organised, for example, maybe forget to take their PE kits into school, and maybe their bedrooms or their backpacks, their personal space is cluttered or chaotic, for example, but are not necessarily recognised as being that ADHD characteristic. Thinking about starting tasks, completing tasks. So maybe for your daughter, she procrastinates or avoids starting assignments, even when she might know they're important. She might leave tasks unfinished or tend to skip from one activity to another. And then it might be that it's not until the very last minute that she sort of relies on the pressure of that last minute pressure to complete the work, really. Time management. So it might be that they sort of really struggle with being able to be in school on time, for example, struggle with appointments, being on time to meet their friends, lose track of time, maybe misjudging how long tasks will take. Emotional regulation difficulties, so maybe becoming really overwhelmed or frustrated or experience anxiety when tasks feel really difficult or complex. And so then we can see maybe big emotional responses, maybe for our girls sort of being tearful, shutting down, withdrawing because of that. And thinking about forgetfulness as well. So it might be that maybe they forget, we give them a set of instructions, a task to do, we give them some chores to do with a couple of multi-step directions, and may struggle to follow those as well. So just thinking about that, for example, if we ask them to, maybe go and tidy their bedroom, and we give them a few tasks, go and bring your washing down, go and bring your dishes down, make your bed, put your books on the shelf, and they get so far and then really struggling to remember all those tasks. So we can see challenges with executive functions, but then quite often for our girls, what can happen is because they're masking, because they're camouflaging, they may not maybe sort of seek some support or attention for those challenges. It might be that they overcompensate, like I've said, if they're struggling with organizational skills, becoming obsessive with checking that they have what they need. Maybe they are always early for appointments, sort of leaving much earlier than they need to manage time management challenges. So we can see for our girls that they really sort of try and maybe hide and overcompensate for some of those challenges. I think it's really important, and I always use this slide whenever I'm talking about ADHD or neurodivergence in general, but we're thinking about in terms of the development of executive functions and also emotional maturation as well. So if you think about your daughter, If you think about, in terms of the development of executive functions, so we're not born with executive functions. They're skills that develop through childhood, through adolescence, and they don't fully mature until around the mid-20s. So if we think about all of those skills developing and fully mature around those mid to late 20s, and what can happen is for our ADHD, for our daughters who have ADHD, what can happen is there can be a delay in the development of those skills. So, for example, if you have a 10-year-old daughter, or a 14-year-old daughter, thinking about what are your expectations in terms of the ability for them to utilize those skills. So let's take, for example, a 14-year-old. Thinking about a 14-year-old, I would expect a 14-year-old girl to be able to get herself dressed independently for school and prepare a bag, get all the books that she needs, any other equipment she needs for school, be able to get herself to and from school independently, get to and from school on time, and be able to do her homework. Would we have those same expectations of a 9-year-old? If we think about 18-year-olds, for example, 18-year-olds in terms of executive functions, we would expect some 18-year-olds are leaving home at the age of 18. They're going off to university. They're living, miles away from home. They are managing budgets. They are managing their studies. They are going shopping, preparing meals, organising themselves for all of those things. Would we have those same expectations of a 12-year-old? And yet, for our children or girls with ADHD, or indeed anybody with ADHD, what we can see is a delay in the development of these skills. So if we've got, if our daughters are really struggling, so if we've got a 14-year-old who we find is struggling to be able to get themselves organised for school, struggling to be able to pack their own bags, struggling to be able to get themselves ready independently in the morning, get themselves to school on time. Is that because actually, in terms of those executive functions, they are operating more like that of a 9-year-old? Now, this isn't about IQ or intelligence. This is purely about the development of these skills. And I think it's really important that we understand where our daughters are sort of developmentally with these skills, because they may well need lots more support around that. Also, in terms of emotional maturation, so if you find yourself saying if you're seeing big emotional responses, shutdown, withdrawal, isolation, and sort of emotional responses that seem immature for their age. So think about that 14-year-old, if you find yourself saying to them, why are you acting like a 9-year-old? Why are you acting like a 10-year-old? Is that actually because in terms of emotional maturation, that's where they are? Are they more, is it about that delay in that emotional maturation? And again, I think that's significant, because if we are to support our daughters appropriately, we need to know where they are in terms of the development of these skills and in terms of that emotional maturation, so they can be supported appropriately. Also, just thinking about, in terms of sensory differences for our girls with ADHD, often they will experience heightened sensory sensitivities. So it might be that they really struggle with certain types of clothing, for example. It might be that they, think about certain fabrics, tags, seams, labels, tight clothes, refusing to wear jeans, refusing to wear tights, really struggling with that. And maybe they become easily overwhelmed with certain types of noises, repetitive type noises, lots of noises, and find it really difficult in crowded, busy environments, for example. It might be that they really struggle with unpredictable touch, unexpected touch. And so that it might be that we find for our girls that when they are in those busy classrooms, busy playgrounds, busy corridors, that those sensory sensitivities can really impact on them on a day-to-day basis. So we might also see sensory seeking behaviours, and certainly in terms of ADHD, we quite often see young people with sensory sensitivities, but also we maybe see some young people who are maybe don't register sensory input as they should, or also sensory seeking behaviour, so maybe always touching things, always moving, always fidgeting with things. And so we might have for our girls that they struggle to, maybe if they are easily overwhelmed by sensory input, that they struggle to concentrate, maybe because of the hum of a fluorescent light, visual stimulation, worried because they're sat in the middle of a classroom and someone might brush past them, touch them unexpectedly. So at home, it might be that they struggle with certain types of foods because of texture, smell, appearance, taste. So we can see for a lot of our girls, we can see some challenges around sensory differences as well. Rejection sensitivity, I just want to mention this. So for some of our girls, they can experience rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So that is basically intense emotional reactions, and that can be to perceived or actual rejection. It might be rejection, criticism, feeling like they've failed, sort of negative or critical feedback, really. And for our girls with ADHD, this sensitivity can be particularly heightened, and can certainly affect them in terms of their confidence, their self-esteem, impact on relationships, and also their overall mental health. So just thinking about it, there's a magazine that we always recommend in the foundation called Attitude Magazine, and they suggest that 99% of adults with ADHD are identifying as being more sensitive than usual to rejection, and with 1 in 3 saying it's the hardest part of living with ADHD. And certainly for our girls, they can experience this heightened rejection sensitivity. And what might that look like? So it might be for our girls, maybe becoming people pleasers. So thinking about scanning when they go into a situation, they go into an environment, that they are scanning everyone to try and figure out, what will this person like me to be? What would they, what do they admire? What would make them want to be with me, spend time with me, like me, not criticize me, not disapprove of me? So they're thinking about that masking presentation, so they can become people pleasers. They go into a situation and they become, present a false self to fit in, to be accepted. Also, they may well stop trying. So if there's any chance whatsoever, any possibility that they're not going to succeed, they're going to fail, they're going to fall short, then it might be that they refuse to engage in activities, they refuse to maybe engage in social situations, they stop with going to activities that they used to, they won't try new things. If there's any chance whatsoever that they're not going to be accepted by their peers, if they're going to be criticized, if they're going to be judged. And then finally, that perfectionism. So again, if we've got young people who are worried about rejection, then they might strive to be the absolute best, strive to get 100%, strive to be perfect. Because if I'm the best, if I'm perfect, nobody will criticize me, reject me, disapprove of me. And so we can see, them actually, nobody can be perfect. Nobody can get 100% all of the time. And so we can see them sort of putting themselves under that pressure to overachieve. Also, just thinking about emotional regulation. So our girls with ADHD often experience challenges with emotional regulation. So we might see sort of intense emotional reactions, and again, thinking about that heightened sensitivity. So it might be that we have, for our girls, maybe finding it really having big, I suppose, strong responses to maybe it's a disagreement, maybe it's a sort of perceived criticism. So we might see big emotional responses to that. We might see crying or yelling or shouting, but we might see withdrawal, isolation. We might see for our girls that they sometimes experience sort of mood swings. So, sort of that rapid shift from feeling happy to going to maybe angry or frustrated or even sad. And might not be that they're sort of triggers for that are always apparent, and they might sort of really find it difficult to understand why their emotions feel so overwhelming. Obviously, rejection sensitivity could impact in terms of emotional regulation, and in terms of masking, it might be that they sort of bottle up those feelings, they bottle up those emotions. And quite often what families will say to me is that for their girls, when they get home, then throughout the day in school, they're reported to be calm, they're reported to be, they're fine, is what a lot of families use, fine in school, and quite calm, composed. But when they get home, then they sort of release all of those pent up emotions. And again, because of masking, because of bottling up those emotions, hiding those emotions, suppressing those emotions, we can see that sort of real dysregulation. Really quickly, in terms of hormones, puberty and periods. So hormonal changes during puberty and periods can certainly significantly impact our girls. So it can intensify those ADHD characteristics, in particular, thinking about emotional dysregulation and impulsivity. So we can see that the fluctuations in those hormone levels, impacting them in terms of mood, their focus, their emotions, and also we can see physical symptoms. So thinking about whether they if they've got sort of period pains, for example, if they've got headaches, if they've got fatigue. So again, that impacting on their ability to manage their emotions, manage that emotional regulation as well. Also, just thinking about self-image and social pressures around this sort of age for our girls. So we might see that they struggle with self-esteem, and we might see them an increase in them comparing themselves to their peers. And so then, also if we think about it in terms of impulsivity, or maybe if they've got some sort of difficulties sort of with managing social interactions, they've sort of sometimes it might affect their confidence, particularly if they kind of feel that they don't quite fit in, or if they feel awkward. Also thinking about what I mentioned before about sharing inappropriate information with others, and maybe through conversations, or even again, like I mentioned earlier, in terms of social media as well. I also think for our girls, they are far more vulnerable to risks during this sort of the adolescent years and onwards. So more vulnerable to maybe things like having sex at a young age, maybe increased risk of pregnancy, vulnerability due to maybe the peer groups that they're mixing with, substance misuse as well. So it can be a really difficult time. It can be a difficult time for any teenage girl, but I also think for our young people with ADHD, there can be additional vulnerabilities really. Moving on to how we're going to support our young people. Unconscious and running out of time. So supporting attention, minimize distractions, using visuals, breaking tasks down into smaller pieces for them. So using things like checklists, as to-do lists, schedules, establishing routines can really support young people to stay on task. They know what to do, can help bring them back to what they need to do. Using reminders, prompts, so it might be reminders in their phone, it might be things like Alexa, they can be really helpful. And also if we have young people who really struggle with maintaining attention, movement breaks can be really helpful with that. Thinking about support and impulsivity. So, if they need to sort of say something or get something out, encouraging them to write it down. So that supports that verbal impulsivity, using post-its, notebooks, so that they haven't got to shout things out, blare things out, and getting them to practice sort of those pause and think skills. So I always say encouraging our girls to sort of pause, take a breath, count to 10, and then sort of respond if they need to. I'm also thinking about developing social awareness. So really getting them to understand the difference between a impulsive reaction and a thoughtful response, providing other outlets are thinking about journaling, for example, and maybe some creative or physical outlets for them. So maybe things like art or dance or sports, practice and relaxation and meditation, and also games like Snap and Jenga can really work on sort of on those impulsivity skills. Hyperactivity. So I always say, if you've got young people that need to move, so making sure that they've got access to movement breaks, appropriate fidget tools as well. So where, stress balls or fidget rings, or even good old blue tack, I always say, but physical activities, encouraging them to participate in activities that are going to help them to sort of use that energy and develop focus. Really, for young people that really struggle to keep still, I would be looking at alternative seating. So thinking about wobble chairs, sit and move cushions, ball cushions, anything that can support that movement while sitting. And also, again, I could always go back to mindfulness and relaxation techniques can be really helpful. Thinking about problem solving activities as well. So just thinking, about things like puzzles, board games, scavenger hunts, anything that requires focus and movement. I always like activities that involve movement, and just again being aware. Help them recognize when they feel restless. What is the outlet that would support them with that? When they're feeling like they can't keep still, what is the strategy that is going to support them with that? Support executive functions. So I always talk about externalizing what's not happening internally. So we've got children, who really struggle with those executive functions. Using things like those written schedules and timetables are really helpful. Again, establishing routines, chunking those tasks down into smaller, more manageable ones. So rather than, for example, saying go and tidy your bedroom, that might be an overwhelming task. Breaking it down into go and make your bed, go and bring your dishes down, supporting them to be able to organize their belongings. So, maybe having one space where they keep everything, for example, and having checklists of what they need for every day in their bags. And I always say praise and reward efforts as well. So lots of the time our children, our girls are being told what they can't do, what they're failing at, what they're not doing very well. And I think we need to flip that narrative for our girl, celebrating what they can do, what they are successful at, but also the effort that they put into. They may not achieve what they set out to do, but quite often they put a lot of effort into doing that. Support sensory needs. I would say, if possible, I know that we haven't all got access to an occupational therapist, but maybe seeking some advice, or looking into what your daughter's sensory differences are, and thinking about how you can adapt the environment, really, I suppose, in terms of support. Now, is there a sensory toolkit that they will benefit from accessing? I'm just rushing on now. I'm sorry, I'm conscious of time. Support and rejection sensitivity is so validating their emotions, reassure them, that just because somebody said something or somebody's done something, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're upset with them. Reframing, what is being sort of said, then reframing their thoughts, thinking about normalizing mistakes, reframing mistakes or criticisms as an opportunity to learn, not as a personal failure, teaching those emotional regulation techniques, and also limiting overwhelm for your young person. I think it's really important that we support mental health. So thinking about, ways in which we can promote self-esteem. So our girls may struggle with self-doubt, negative self-talk. So I'm talking to them about what their strengths are, celebrating their strengths, highlighting those strengths, again, promoting that emotional regulation, and the importance of, good sleep, exercise, diet, promoting all of those things for your young person. And also for me, the key is self-awareness and the understanding of diagnosis. What does ADHD mean for them? What does it look like? Yes, you are going to have challenges, but what are your strengths? What are the strengths? How can we play to those strengths, and how can we support the things that you find difficult, and normalize and sort of seeking support, and also helping them to identify their emotional patterns, again externalizing that for them. So maybe use the rating scale like is on screen there, maybe using zones of regulation, but talking to your young person about, you know, how they feel, and helping them to identify and name their emotions, and then also how identifying strategies that would support them to manage those emotions, and thinking about, you know, things like quiet time, physical activity. So if they might need a break throughout the day, for example, maybe when they first come home from school that they need a break, physical activities to support emotional regulation, to help them you know, de-escalate if they're starting to become sort of dysregulated, having that sensory toolkit, so maybe having access to those fidgets, for example, teaching strategies such as muscle relaxation, deep breathing, self-massage, using technology, yoga, meditation. They're all really good strategies to support sensory needs and emotional regulation. Also thinking about supporting during puberty, educate them about, you know, hormonal changes, so that they know what those hormonal changes may well look like and the impact it may well have on them, providing emotional support and those self-regulation techniques. Also thinking about promoting their sort of physical well-being and supporting any challenges around that. So, you know, encouraging things like regular exercise and eating that balanced diet and good sleep hygiene, but also helping them prepare for things like periods by having maybe a period kit, you know, having access to pain relief, those types of things. And then finally, just thinking about that inclusive and supportive home environment. So thinking about, you know, acceptance, understand, encourage self-acceptance, celebrate strengths, provide routine, provide structure, praise your daughter's efforts, encourage interests and strengths, and think about having open communication. Be a safe space for your child to talk about anything that they may find difficult. So that was a whistle-stop tour. I'm conscious I've gone over. I do apologise.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Tracy. There were some great strategies and advice in there. We've had a lot of questions submitted, so we will try and answer as many as possible. Our first question is, our daughter has started swearing a lot. Bad words are said in the times of frustration and just off the cuff. We're really struggling to find information on this and whether it's linked to ADHD, how we can stop it from happening. Any advice?
So as I mean, you know, it can be. I think with any young person, if they are, you know, feeling frustrated, then, you know, that the response to that, or it might be frustration, it might be upset, it might be overwhelm, it might be embarrassment. And for me, when I think about any behavior, so whether that's swearing, whether that's hitting out or throwing, whatever that is, I think about the behavior iceberg, I suppose. And that is what we're seeing. So we're seeing swearing, we're seeing that you know, the shouting out, the bad language. So that's what we're seeing. And the key is to really unpick that. Now, any child or young person might use swearing as, you know, a response to what is going on for them. There's a guy called Stuart Shanker, and when he talks about the 5 domains of stress. And so he talks about, when we're looking under the iceberg as to why we're seeing those behaviors, thinking about, you know, and quite often we think about the emotions that they may well be feeling. So are they feeling embarrassed? Are they feeling frustrated? And quite rightly, we need to do so, but we also need to be thinking about other factors. So it might be that there's biological factors. So it might be that they haven't slept very well, they're hungry or hangry, as it were. It might be about social factors. So it might be about issues with friendship groups. It might be cognitive challenges. So it might be challenges around those executive functions, and they you know, they are struggling to be able to remember instructions, they're struggling to be able to stay on task. There can be a number of reasons, really. And so I suppose the answer to that is yes, it may be because of those ADHD characteristics presentations, but but it may not be. What I would be looking at really is in terms of what is the reason, what is the underlying reason for the swearing and the bad language, really, and is there something that you can support to prevent them feeling that way in the first place? And because that's just the response. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if that makes sense.
That was great, Tracy. Thank you. Our next question is, my daughter is 14 and not formally diagnosed with ADHD, although I see many traits. The school have no concerns as she's a model pupil. It's just at home where we see the issue. Should I just use the help and advice that is out there, or am I failing her by not getting a diagnosis?
So that's a really good question. So for me, I think in terms of diagnosis, it's very personal. Okay. For me, diagnosis is important, can be important in terms of understanding yourself, you know, understanding what ADHD means for you. I would I'm not sure how old her daughter is. If she's old enough, it might be worthwhile a conversation. So, for example, I've got a daughter, and I had a conversation with her about whether she felt she would benefit from going for assessment. And for her, she made the decision that self-identification is enough for her. She recognizes the challenges that she experiences. She knows her strengths, and she uses those strengths and support her her challenges, I suppose. For me, I would maybe have a conversation with your daughter if she's of an age where she would understand that, and maybe have a conversation with school as well and talk about the difference in presentation that you're seeing. You know, maybe have a little look at that diagnostic criteria and think about what that means for your daughter, how that might present. Talk to the Senko in the school as well about how if she is presenting differently, if she's masking in school, why that may well be. But I think you know, again, diagnosis, it's very personal, very individual, very unique to every individual and family. If you feel that she can be supported with diagnosis and without diagnosis, and if there's no benefit to that, then you know that's entirely up to you. What I would do there is, whilst you are maybe pursuing diagnosis or considering whether you're going to pursue diagnosis, whether you're going to take that further with the Senko, and it's definitely worthwhile having those conversations, I would certainly want to identify the areas of challenge she may well be experiencing so that she can be fully supported. I also think it's important that if school are not picking up on areas that she may find difficult, that we highlight that to school and explain that to school. I always say go prepared, you know, go with all your information, communicate with school, and because ultimately what can happen is, and you know, the lived experience of ADHD, if you speak to or read anything that's written by a woman with ADHD, so some of the recommendations I would say is sort of Kat Brown, It's Not a Bloody Trend, she was fantastic, and Ellie Middleton, who wrote Unmasked. They talk about they weren't identified or diagnosed as having ADHD until later in life. And what they talk about is sort of the challenges that they experienced and the impact it had on them. So I think it's about having those open forms of communication and making sure everyone is aware. And it might be that, you know, particularly if she's younger, that she's fully supported in a nurturing primary school, for example, but then as she gets older and the needs to be more independent, then those challenges become more evident, or maybe the sort of more struggles more. So I'm thinking about what I mentioned earlier about that delay in terms of the development of those executive functions. It might be the expectations of your daughter might start to be unrealistic because of where maybe she's at in terms of the development of those executive functions. Hope that makes sense.
That's great, thank you. Our next question is there a link between ADHD and eating disorders in girls?
So we quite often girls with ADHD are often diagnosed. Eating disorders is often one of the conditions that is often diagnosed before ADHD. I would also say in terms of sensory difficulties as well, quite often we can see some eating challenges around sensory sensitivities. So quite often, if we think about, we can see with ADHD, we can see impulsive eating, we can see limited diet, restricted diets. So yes, is I suppose the short answer to that.
Thank you. Our next question is, everything you're talking about is completely what my 15-year-old twin girls are going through. Would it be better to get a diagnosis of ADHD even though they are already diagnosed with autism?
Okay, yeah, so what I never mentioned earlier when I've touched on co-occurrence is that actually autism and ADHD are one of the most common co-occurring conditions. I feel, unfortunately it's not the case, but I feel that when we are assessing for autism or we're assessing for ADHD, it will be beneficial to have that sort of dual assessment. Unfortunately, that is quite often not the case, dependent on what area you live in. And for me, I would say, whilst there can be overlap in terms of the presentation of autism and ADHD, they are also both very distinct conditions with distinct diagnostic criteria. And for me, I certainly would see the benefit. Again, it's a personal choice, but I would see the benefits in terms of understanding what that means for your daughters. Definitely, having that assessment. But again, for some, like I've said, identification, identifying as also having ADHD can be enough for some people. I suppose it depends in terms of if you're thinking about school, if you think about college, university, employment in the future, when you're thinking about support needs, reasonable adjustments, those types of equality in the workplace, if you're thinking about those things longer term, is it can be it is beneficial to have that diagnosis, and also just to think in terms of self-identity, understanding yourself as well. So it could be helpful, personal choice again, but I definitely see the benefits in maybe pursuing a assessment.
That's great, thank you. We've got time for one more question. Our question is, do you have any advice on sleep? We feel like we've tried everything.
Oh my gosh, it's a workshop in itself, isn't it, really? So ADHD and sleep, we often see lots and lots of sleep challenges for our young people with ADHD. And that might be, it depends on the sleep challenges in and of itself. So we often see children who really find it difficult to settle to sleep. So because of those busy brains, can't switch off, for example. We often see oh God, the not finding it difficult to settle to sleep. We can see delayed sleep phase. Now, delayed sleep phase is when we don't feel tired. So insomnia can be when we are tired, but we're finding it difficult to settle to sleep. Delayed sleep phase is when they don't feel sleepy until a couple of hours later, but once they are sleepy, they settle down. So quite common challenges that we see with ADHD. also staying asleep as well. So I think in terms of settling to sleep, I would say if they're struggling with settling to sleep, I would be thinking about having really good sleep hygiene. I'm sure you've done this already. Thinking about what activities they're engaging in before bed. I've had families who've said, you know, I wore them out, I took them to the park, they should have been exhausted, but actually they were bouncing off walls, couldn't get them to sleep. And that's about those sensory systems. We've got a sensory system called the vestibular system, which is about movement. And what happened, it's also linked to our alertness levels. The children running around at the park actually has a counter effect. Instead of wearing them out, using that energy, actually what we've done is we've overstimulated them. I was also thinking about screen time, you know, switching electronic devices off. I appreciate for some that might cause some conflict, which can have a counter effect. So maybe thinking about managing them with blue light filters, also maybe using sleepy foods. We talk about certain types of foods for supper. So foods that contain something called tryptophan can be helpful. And then thinking about children, young people who maybe struggle to with staying asleep, thinking about when we go through sleep cycles. And so when we transition from one sleep cycle to the next, we have these things called partial awakenings. If things have changed in the environment, even slightly, sometimes that can cause our young people to become fully awake. And so then we might have difficulty resettling them again. So thinking about, is there anything in the environment that changes? I mean, it's a whole session in and of itself, to be honest. Maybe check out the sleep charity. They can be really helpful. The Sleep Foundation, and also Contact for Disabled Children. They have some ideas, don't need, you know, around sleep support, and also Cerebra. So maybe check out those organisations for some additional information around sleep as well. I'm sorry, but it's a whole presentation in and of itself.